We're going to be looking at World War II today, and the essay question for World War II is discuss the background leading to and the results of World War II. Your discussion must cover America's attitudes toward foreign affairs following World War I, FDR's political pragmatism, the key events that got the United States involved in World War II, and show how those results led to the Cold War. So for this segment, we'll be looking at Concept 1, discussing America's attitude toward foreign affairs following World War I, and show how those attitudes developed into an isolationist policy. So, the term isolationist is misleading in a few respects. It is true that President Harding and Coolidge and Hoover and Roosevelt in their first terms avoided any sort of, quote, entangling alliances. However, no one objected to America's continuing search for growth, for world markets and economic influences. Before World War I, the main flow of investment capitals ran from Europe to America. But during the war and after, the movement of capital had reversed itself, and America had become the world's leading creditor nation. Hence, isolationism, as it's used to describe the mood and actions of the country between the presidencies of Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, must be defined in strictly a political sense. The post-war mood of the 1920s led to a return of this political isolationist pattern. The retreat from an active world policy started in 1920 and turned into a headlong fight back to isolationism in the 1930s. So the following factors explain America's movement into isolationism. First, you had isolationism has been a long American tradition, which historically traces its roots back to the days of, all the way back to George Washington, with his proclamation of neutrality of 1793. From the 1790s until the Spanish-American War, American neutrality remained unchallenged, and it developed into a tradition that was asserted, at least initially, with respect to every major international conflict before World War II. So, the retreat to isolationism started in 1920 with the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles and America's entry into the League of Nations by the U.S. Senate. The actions by the Senate were overwhelmingly ratified at the polls in the 1920 election. In the election, the voters expressed their yearning for normalcy, and President-elect Harding lost little time in indulging it by disposing of the League of Nations, at least the United States' involvement in the League of Nations. Clearly, the League was an alliance, an open-ended commitment of the very sort which the Founding Fathers had warned against. Wilson, in fact, promoted American participation in the international organization as, quote, an entirely new course of action, unquote, made necessary by the fact that the isolation of the United States was at an end. Quote, not because we chose to go into the politics of the world, but because by the sheer genius of this people and the growth of our power, we have become a determining factor in the history of mankind. And after you have become a determining factor in the history of mankind, you cannot remain isolated, whether you want to or not, unquote. Again, that's from President Wilson pitching his ideas for the League of Nations, which, as discussed earlier, the Senate would reject. The isolationists generally agreed with the contention that isolationism was no longer a realistic aim, if indeed it ever had been, but took sharp issue with the proposed policy reversal. Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts told his Senate colleagues in 1919, quote, nobody expects to isolate the United States or make it a hermit nation, which is sheer absurdity, unquote. But he warned at the same time against the United States that injury. He warned against the injury of the United States would do itself by, quote, meddling in all differences which may arise among any portion or fragment of humankind, unquote. And he urged continued adherence to, quote, the policy of Washington and Hamilton, under which we have risen to our present greatness and prosperity, unquote. So what he's referring to is Washington's last, his farewell address to the nation, where he warned the United States should not get involved in entangling alliances with Europe. So the United States is really going to harken back to that and avoid getting involved in anything going on in Europe, as Europe is disintegrating in political instability during the 20s and the 30s. Next, since American intervention in World War I had clearly failed to make the world safe for democracy, this was one of the big justifications for the war. This is to make the world safe for democracy. This apparently demonstrated the wisdom that meddling in the affairs of others was useless and self-defeating. Consequently, as totalitarianism regimes increasingly threatened the peace of Europe, the United States adopted a series of neutrality acts between 1935 and 1937 to help preserve its isolationist philosophy in order to avoid involvement in the war. The Neutrality Act of 1935 was explicitly designed to prevent a reoccurrence of the events that had pulled the United States into World War I. The act imposed an embargo on arms trades with countries at war and declared that American citizens could travel on belligerent ships only at their own risks, right? So they're trying to learn from the lessons of World War I that dragged the United States into that war. Congress expanded the Neutrality Acts in 1936 to include no loans to belligerents being warring nations. In the spring of 1937, isolationism reached a peak as the Gallup poll reported 94% of its respondents preferred efforts to keep out of war over efforts to prevent war. So anytime you have 94% of Americans polling on any one issue, you know you have a virtual consensus. Consequently, in 1937, Congress passed a third Neutrality Act, which was even stricter by adopting a cash and carry provision. So if a country was at war and wanted to purchase non-military goods from the United States, it had to pay cash and pick up the supplies in its own ships. Congress intended this restriction to prevent American trading ships from being the targets of attacks as they were in World War I. The neutrality legislation played directly into the hands of Adolf Hitler. This is the big historical lesson learned in the interwar period between World War I and World War II. Right? So bent on conquest of Europe, he could now proceed without worrying about American interference. Right? So this lesson, whether it's applicable to current geopolitics or not, right or wrong, this is something that American policymakers consistently refer to. Right? If we had dealt with Adolf Hitler in the early 30s, so goes this lesson, the United States' involvement in World War II would not have been so consequential. So probably nothing did more to heighten American isolationism or anti-American feelings in Europe than the war debt issue. So this is the third reason why we're getting into this war, or why we've not gotten to this war, but adopted isolationist policies. So as discussed during World War I, when Allies had begun to exhaust their credit, the United States government advanced them funds first for the war effort and then for the post-war reconstruction. A World War I Foreign Debt Commission created by Congress in 1922 renegotiated the Allied debt to America to a total of about $11.5 billion, adding the interest payable over 62 years to this principal. The Allied debt came to something over $22 billion. Right, that was real money back then. Today it's a billion here and a billion here. seems to add up to nothing, but back then $22 billion we're talking about real money. To America at large, it all seemed a simple matter of obligation, but Europeans commonly had a different perception. The British noted that Americans had repudiated debts to British investors after the American War for Independence. The French also pointed out that they had never been repaid for their help, although the money they loaned was paid back in that war. Most difficult were the practical problems of repayment. In order to pay the debt, European debtors had to sell their goods to the United States. But tariff walls, as we discussed in the last lecture, went higher in 1921 and 1922, as discussed also, and again in 1930, making the debt payment virtually impossible. When the British and the French insisted they could only pay their debts as they collected reparations from Germany, American bankers worked out a rescue plan in 1924 by lending Germany over $100 million. So goes international geobanking politics. The whole structure finally did collapse during the Great Depression. In 1931, President Hoover negotiated a moratorium on both German reparations and Allied payment of war debts, thereby indirectly accepting the connection between the two. So once the United States had accepted the connection between reparations and the war debt, the Allies virtually canceled German reparations, reducing them in 1932 to only $750 million, which was also never paid. At the end of 1932, after Hoover's debt moratorium ended, most of the European countries defaulted on their war debts to the United States. In retaliation, Congress passed the Johnson Debt Default Act of 1934, which prohibited private loans to any such government. Fourth, between 1934 and 1936, the country was much impressed by Senator Gerald P. Nye's investigation into the munitions industry during World War I. The Senate Munitions Investigating Committee, headed by the isolationist Nye, probed for possible alliances between the munition industry, Wall Street, banking, housing, and the military. So it was a pre-military-industrial complex theory. It found no criminal conspiracy, but it did expose war profiteering and suggested that the weapon industry had helped draw America into the war on the side of the Allies. The Nye hearings strengthened the country's isolationist mood. No proof was forthcoming, but the public was prepared to believe that the worst of businessmen during the Depression and accepted the Merchants of Death thesis developed by Senator Nye. Fifth, also in the 1930s, highly respected historians charged that the country's involvement in World War I had been a tragic mistake. Not only munition makers, but greedy international bankers, clever British propagandists, and pro-British sentimentalists in the Wilson administration had caused the error. It must never happen again, so was the sentiment. And sixth, so after World War I, the conviction had grown that large armaments had been the war's cause, and that arms limitation was the lasting answer to peace. Under the building program begun in 1916, the United States constructed a navy second only to Britain. Neither Britain nor Americans had much stomach for the cost of naval armaments race with the other, but both shared a common concern with the alarming growth of Japanese power. To deal with the growing strains, the glorious vision of abolishing war at the stroke of a pen culminated in a number of international conferences. and treaties such as the Washington Armament Conference of 1922, the Central American Conference of 1922-1923, the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact of 1928, and finally the London Naval Conference of 1930. A pact was signed by the United States and France and was an agreement to ban war. It was subsequently ratified by more than 60 countries, but proved ineffective against obvious Nazi aggression in the 1930s. Sixth was Sixth was the Depression. The Depression made foreign policy seem remote and unimportant to most Americans, right? We had bigger problems to solve at home. As unemployment increased and economic crisis intensified after 1929, many people grew apathetic about events abroad. During his first term of office, Roosevelt was an isolationist, and he resisted entering into agreements for any alliance that might interfere with solving the nation's domestic crisis. Consequently, he also rejected any chance to deal with economic problems on an international basis because he wanted the freedom to experiment with currency manipulation as a device to fight the Great Depression. Thus, he helped undermine the International Monetary Conference in 1933, which might have stabilized the world currency at the expense of the domestic economy, which obviously Roosevelt wasn't going to do. Roosevelt's action dealt a severe blow to international cooperation, and the epilogue was Europe's final default on war debts and further American drift towards isolationism.